Fortunately for us sitting here comfortably in the present, the Cold War remained, well, for the most part, cold. Soviet tanks never smashed through the Fulda Gap, and our leaders never actually hit those little, or big depending on who you ask, red buttons to hurl nukes at each other. The Cold War was in many ways a political conflict, fought with ideas, propaganda, and persuasion. It was a war of words that just happened to be backed up by massive nuclear and conventional arsenals on both sides. Due to the way the conflict played out, the radio waves over Europe were among the hottest battlegrounds of the Cold War, and some would argue among the most consequential. Dissidents, party officials, and just regular comrades behind the Iron Curtain would later testify to the importance that Western radio broadcasts had in ultimately bringing down the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War. I'm your host David, and today we are tuning into Shortwave. This is the Cold War. Of all the broadcasts into the East, two American shortwave radio stations stand out above the rest in terms of the impact they had on the Cold War: Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe was directed at the satellite states, while Radio Liberty was directed right at the heart of the USSR. Both of these stations were privately funded, giving them more freedom to take the gloves off, as it were, with their content than the official US government outlet, Voice of America. The truth is that the origins of these projects were more than a little murky and make up a truly fascinating chapter of Cold War intrigue. But you know what, before we dig too deep into these stations and their history, we should go over a few things about shortwave radio. Today, especially in the developed world, there's not a lot of action on the radio waves, and it may be easy to forget about it in our internet age. But during the Cold War, shortwave radio was one of the best ways for a nation to spread its message and project soft power across otherwise sealed borders and around the globe. Without going into too much tech stuff, a broadcaster would be able to send radio signals over long distances and target them in a general direction with shortwave radio. In the specific case of Europe, a powerful transmitter in England, let's say, could direct the signal towards the Soviet Union and have a reasonable chance of being heard loud and clear in Moscow. Powerful stations can even be heard from across oceans, and by using relay stations, you could pretty much get your message across anywhere on the globe. In short, shortwave radio allowed Western governments to broadcast their side of the story to the communist world. The democratic world sent their messages east via the BBC, Deutsche Welle, Radio Netherlands, and Voice of America, all priding themselves on the objectivity of their reporting. These official news outlets certainly challenged the Kremlin's narrative, but with admittedly less ardor than Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were intentionally provocative and confrontational to Soviet media. The Eastern Bloc, for its part, pushed back with Radio Prague, Voice of Romania, Radio Tirana, Radio Berlin International, and of course Radio Moscow, among a few others. Despite a valiant effort from the communists, the broadcasts coming from the West had a much bigger impact on the outcome of the Cold War. We have quotes from prominent Eastern Bloc figures such as Boris Yeltsin, Lech Walesa of the Polish Solidarity Movement, and Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia, all emphasizing the importance of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that they had in exhausting the USSR on the battlefront of ideas. The broadcasts from the East, on the other hand, were more of a curiosity for the Western public and never really had an impact on public discourse. In fairness, shortwave radio usage was always high in the communist world, while television progressively edged out radio in the West as the Cold War waged on. This phenomenon has carried on to the present, as the remaining shortwave broadcasters usually don't bother targeting broadcasts to the developed world, but focus on places like the Middle East, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, where radio listenership for news is still relatively high compared to television and the internet. Outside news and information was usually not welcome by the various communist governments of Europe, but here's the thing, not even an iron curtain can stop radio waves. They don't stop at national borders. Sure, there are ways to jam broadcasts, but they're not anywhere near 100% foolproof, and it takes a lot of effort on the part of the jamming party to get even a little bit of success. What's more is that once those radio waves hit their intended targets, there's no way to detect whether or not they've been received unless the listener gets caught in the act. If someone wanted to listen to a forbidden Western broadcast, all they had to do was move the dial to something else after they were done and not get caught listening in progress, and there's no way to tell that it ever happened. This made radio an extremely important lifeline of information to dissidents and the man on the street in the communist world. If listeners could catch a broadcast, they would not only catch news that may have been suppressed in their home countries, but usually some sort of cultural programming, interviews, special features, stories, and of course music, which helped create something of a connection between people on both sides. Through radio, people in the communist world were able to visualize life in the West, contrast it with their reality, and picture how someday, maybe, things could be different. These broadcasts chipped away at the Soviet Union's stranglehold on Eastern Europe, and even at home in the USSR. Now, governments have been using radio for propaganda purposes pretty much since the outset of radio. During World War II, just a few short years earlier than the period we're currently talking about, the United States delved right into radio by setting up systems around the globe. The Americans used shortwave to undermine Axis governments on their home turf and to counter the Axis narrative in occupied and neutral territories, as well as to pass on messages to resistance fighters. They also used it to provide news and music from home to the GIs abroad, so the experience and know-how was already there. The brainchild behind Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was none other than American diplomat and legendary Cold War figure George Kennan, author of The Long Telegram that helped shape American policy towards the Soviet Union in the early days of the conflict. Kennan envisioned a network of émigrés from the Eastern Bloc who were able to communicate directly to the people behind the Iron Curtain and act as a surrogate free press to challenge the communists' grip on information within their realm. It was important, Kennan believed, that most of the speaking be done by voices that would be familiar to Eastern Europeans rather than non-native speakers from the West. Kennan believed that containing the spread of communism would be more than just a military affair. It would be a political and ideological battle as well. He truly believed that the fate of the free world was in balance, and sometimes when people truly believe in a cause, well, they don't mind bending the rules a little bit, if the ends justifies the means. He wanted this radio project to look like an organic grassroots reaction from the American public, along with Eastern European dissidents, and as a separate, independent acting entity from the United States government. The truth was that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty had the CIA and State Department's fingerprints all over it from the very start. In order to make this operation look like a spontaneous reaction to the rise of communism, a committee was formed in 1949 among the most prominent citizens with the purpose of creating a platform to speak directly to the people of the Soviet client states and spread the idea of democracy and liberty. This committee was called the National Committee for a Free Europe and was founded by Allen Dulles, another figure who will loom large over the Cold War. Stay tuned for future episodes on this vital figure. But anyways, where was I? Right, who was involved? The cast of characters behind this project includes some of the most powerful figures in America at the time. The committee included Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower and Lucius Clay, two key figures of the American military presence in Europe, to put it lightly. There were also some of the most prominent figures in American media at the time, such as director Cecil B. DeMille and Time Inc. executive Charles Douglas Jackson, both of whom had ties with American intelligence during the Second World War. Henry Luce, a magazine magnate and dubbed, quote, the most influential private citizen of his time, end quote, was in on it too. So it's hard to look at this cast of characters and see it as anything other than a loosely covered government operation. In order to raise funds for the radio station, the National Committee for a Free Europe created the Crusade for Freedom. The Crusade was formed by Frank Wisner, an important figure in early Cold War intelligence. General Eisenhower was the public face in the early days, styling himself as a concerned private citizen. They traveled around the country with a giant freedom bell, modeled after the Liberty Bell. The campaign also gathered signatures from citizens to uphold a pledge to declare their faith in freedom and to resist tyranny. The bell and the signatures would be delivered to West Berlin on October 24, 1950. Nothing if not subtle, right? The so-called Crusade lasted from 1950 to 1960, and along the way used Hollywood and the great publishers of the time to raise money for Radio Free Europe. The American public, in the midst of the Red Scare, was asked to donate small amounts of money to push back against communism. Now, it wasn't so much that they were looking for a certain number of dollars. They could get all the money they needed through covert government funding. The important thing was to be able to show a large number of donors in order to make it look like the project had mass support among the American public. People were asked to donate freedom dollars. A dollar definitely had more purchasing power back then, but was still within the budget of most middle-class families, and was a reasonable request to keep the evil tentacles of the godless Reds at bay. Radio Free Europe took to the airways on July 4th, 1950, certainly a symbolic choice of dates for domestic consumption, in the US at least. They based their operations out of an office in Munich and had transmitters in Portugal and Spain, as well as Germany. Listeners were able to tune in to alternative takes on the news and events of the day and hear from dissident voices from their own countries. The staff at Radio Free Europe analyzed reports coming out of the communist sphere, as well as those from other foreign news sources who were able to report from behind the Iron Curtain. All of the approved news coming out of the East was corroborated with the first-hand experiences of emigres, diplomats, and journalists who had had recent access to the now forbidden lands. Overall, Radio Free Europe's method of analysis was able to get them pretty close to the target of what was really happening in the East, and they were generally viewed as being a more reliable source of local news than the official outlets. Rude prava indeed. As you can imagine, Radio Free Europe was a real thorn in the side for the Kremlin, and definitely not what they needed while consolidating their gains in Eastern Europe. Joseph Stalin personally demanded that the station be jammed, but again, jamming isn't completely airtight, and the radio waves get through, usually at little more than a minor annoyance to the listener. The Soviets even went so far as having all radio sets come from the factory without the ability to receive shortwave signals, but people were able to get around this with a few components easily available on the black market and a little bit of know-how. During the Cold War, jamming the airwaves would become a method of escalating or de-escalating tensions between the superpowers. When the Cold War heated up, the Soviets would often respond by upping their efforts to jam broadcasting, such as during the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Prague Spring. During periods of warmer relations, the Soviets let their hair down a little bit. They were always attempting to jam something, but some things such as musical programs were seen as a little less nefarious than outright imperialist capitalist Yankee lies. Radio Liberty hit the airwaves of the Soviet Union on March 1st, 1953. Initially, the station was called Radio Liberation and funded by another shadowy CIA operation called the American Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia. Whew. But it was decided that the term liberation was a little too inflammatory, as it implied an overthrow of the Soviet regime. I mean, Washington probably wouldn't be too happy if the Ruskies started overthrow the capitalist radio from Cuba, right? Radio Liberty had a very major news event land in their lap only a couple of days after its inception: the death of Joseph Stalin on March 5th, 1953. Millions of people throughout the Soviet Union were glued to their radios, hungry for information, and Radio Liberty was right there on the spot. Before long, Radio Liberty would be broadcast in most of the minority languages of the Soviet Union, and even from a transmitter in Taiwan to spread the word to the Soviet Far East. Stalin wouldn't be the last communist to be irked by America's shortwave antics, though. RFE-RL's operations were constantly under the threat of infiltration by the various intelligence services of the communist world. Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian correspondent, was murdered in 1978 in London, allegedly by Bulgarian intelligence. Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania really seemed to have an axe to grind with Radio Free Europe. In 1981, he ordered the covert bombing of the Radio Free Europe's headquarters in Munich, causing a lot of injuries and damage, but ultimately no deaths. There were also 4 deaths of Romanian correspondents under highly suspect circumstances that may have had his fingerprints on them as well. In 1959, Czechoslovakian intelligence plotted to poison the salt shakers in the office's cafeteria, but that plan fell through. Radio Free Europe probably had its darkest moments during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. This is a subject that's still up for historical debate, but many Hungarians felt emboldened to stand up to the Soviets by what they understood to be assurances of aid from the West coming from RFE's studio. The people of Hungary tuned in and got impassioned encouragement to continue the revolution and some practical advice on how to resist Soviet tanks. It was all seen as hollow agitation that ended up with the USSR violently crushing the rebellion at the cost of some 2,500 Hungarian lives. In 1967, the American left-wing magazine Ramparts ran an expose on CIA funding of the radio stations, which led to it being removed from the CIA's budget by the US Senate in 1971. The stations were put under the umbrella of the Board of International Broadcasting, another government organization, but maybe without the same kind of baggage as the CIA or even the State Department. The 2 stations merged as one in 1976 as RFE-RL, as it's known today. RFE-RL had some very bright moments in the Cold War. During the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, millions tuned in for frank and accurate information about the situation, while they were getting little more than Swan Lake from Moscow. While it was still difficult to report accurately on the disaster from the outside, RFE-RL did their best to let listeners know about the dangers of fallout and keeping them up to date on conditions. During Mikhail Gorbachev's period of glasnost, RFE-RL was allowed a longer leash by Moscow, and they were able to get direct access to officials for interviews for the first time. During the 1991 August coup, the station offered some of the most complete and accurate coverage during this chaotic period, and gave Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev a platform to speak directly to the people. RFE-RL really was responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union. Communism crumbled, and through the 1990s, RFE-RL stopped broadcasting to the newly democratic nations of Eastern Europe one by one. Although the Cold War may be over, the work of RFE-RL continues as they currently broadcast to 22 countries in 26 different languages. Today, the headquarters of RFE-RL is in Prague, a city that used to be on the receiving end of these forbidden transmissions from the West, and chalk it up as another marker as to who came out ahead in the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and a big thank you to Ryan Llewellyn for today's script. Make sure to check out Ryan's excellent podcast, Cold War Cast, where he talks all things Cold War. Please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or via YouTube membership. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.